going to begin talking today about the animal kingdom, and some of the simplest creatures in the animal kingdom are the sponges. They belong in the phylum Porifera, which means pore-bearing or pore-bearer. They're one of the simplest animals that don't have any specialized tissues or muscles and relatively few structures. One of the first is they have this large osculum or opening. And so every sponge looks a little differently, but this has a really large opening called an osculum and lots of teeny tiny pores all around it. And they have these little collar cells right here that have a whipping flagella. And they whip back and forth, causing a current to pull water in. They can filter it to feed and then release the water out. They have not a true skeleton system at all, but they have these little structures called spicules, and I've drawn these really huge. They're actually microscopic, but they have this little Y-shaped spicule that they're all inside of here that give it its structure. So when you use a natural sponge, all of the cells are dead, but you have these spicules and some of those structures left. So here is the notes page for this. So the name Porifera means pore-bearer. They have to live in water. They can be in fresh or salt water. Now, we said that all animals have to move. Well, the adults are sessile, and sessile means that you don't move around. They remain attached to some surface. However, the larvae have little cilia, and they can swim till they find a nice hard surface. All sponges are asymmetrical, and what that means is that there's no true symmetry to them. You can't cut them in equal halves. Now, some might look that way, and that's just a fluke, but there's within a species, within different types of sponges, you can't go through and cut them any certain way. So they are the only phylum that we have in the animal kingdom that is considered asymmetrical, and they're filter feeders as well. So as we saw in the picture before, they basically don't have any complex tissues, but they just have some different cell types. They have the osculum, which is where the water and waste are expelled. They have little pores. They have some epithelials, which are little cells that can detect chemicals. They can close up so that they make the pores close up as well. The little collar cells that line the interior of the cell helps to bring in water when the flagella flaps around. They have amoebocytes, which help in reproduction. They carry nutrients and also help make the spicules. And then spicules are their hard support system. As far as reproduction goes, they reproduce asexually by fragmenting or budding, which means little tiny sponges that are clones will grow off of the original sponge, and then those can actually break off and end up finding a new place and settling down to form new colonies. They also have sexual reproduction, though. And the sponges are typically hermaphrodites, which means they have both male and female reproductive organs. And they can have internal or external fertilization. So, for example, sometimes they have a really strong tide, and all the sponges will release either sperm or eggs, and then hopefully they fertilize in the water. Please disregard where we sketched life cycle in 716. You do not have the blue book. Oh, and one unique thing you can do is in the right conditions in a lab, you can blend up a sponge and let it settle, and it will reform into a new colony of sponges. All right, so that is our first phylum. Here are some introductions to them. These are finger sponges. And each one of these, you can see the little osculum. Here's some more sponges with the osculum being up here at the top. This picture right here will show the sponge. You have the little collar cells. So just some different pictures for you to see. The next phylum we have is the Cnidarians. The C is silent, so we have phylum Cnidaria. So your corals, your hydras, your jellyfish, your anemones. And one thing they all have in common is that they have stinging cells called nematocysts. And even though they may not sting us, they have these little harpoon-like structures that can shoot out, and we just don't get affected the same way with every single cnidarian. So some of their toxins don't bother us. Some really are bad on us. One thing is that they do not have a true stomach or mouth. What they have is a simple gastrovascular cavity. So in this picture right here, in the center of all the different tentacles, they would have this gastrovascular cavity, and the tentacles could actually bring the food down to it. Here you have a little area that is going through spermatogenesis and creating sperm. Here you have an egg, so they can have sexual reproduction. They can also have asexual reproduction, again, by budding or creating this little polyp form. So the Greek word comes from nettle, and if you think about stinging nettle, you'll understand why. Again, these are all aquatic. There's freshwater and saltwater versions. Some are sessile, which means they don't move, just the larvae move, and others can move their entire life. So some of the jellies will move around their entire life. We have a different type of symmetry here. We now have radial symmetry. So no matter where I cut this thing, you're going to have equal left and right halves. So if I cut it around an axis, you'll have equal left and right halves. Cnidarians can display one of two forms. They can either be a polyp, which is like what we see here, where it's attached to the bottom and the little tentacles are free-flowing, or a medusa, more like what you think of as a typical jellyfish. They feed by stinging and tangling their prey. They actually have a defined layers of tissue, so they're evolving a little bit here, a little more complex. They have one opening. They have a simple nervous system made up of a nerve net. There's no type of brain or anything like that, and a primitive stomach. They can reproduce sexually and asexually. Sexual reproduction typically only occurs in the medusa stage, and the asexual reproduction typically only occurs in the polyp stage. And I will show you that and some examples of that in class. So here's a typical medusa, little jelly, and here's some of your anemones, and you can see that gastrovascular cavity right there. So you see your little bud right here, your little hydra bud. We will look at hydras in class. They have tentacles. There's the gastrovascular cavity. But you can see it's just one nice big layer of tissue. Still very simple. Our next phylum is the Platyhelminthes, and those are generally called flatworms. Planaria are the ones we have in class that we're going to be looking at under a microscope. Also tapeworms and flukes. They're typically hermaphrodites. Again, they carry both sexes. We have evolved a little more complexity here. We have some eye spots. So this little guy right here actually looks cross-eyed, and they are quite funny to look at under a microscope. Those are his eye spots. Basically, they sense light, and I'll show you in class how to simulate what they see. They have a simple ganglia. Right in here, they have a simple nerve net throughout their body. It runs all the way to the end. It's not really a brain. It's the primitive start to a brain. And then some may be parasitic. This little guy is a planaria, and so he's got his eye spot, his nerve net, and then he has one opening. Again, Platyhelminthes, we only have one opening, so everything you do is in and out of the same spot. This is the pharynx, and it's sort of like a little straw that drops down from his primitive stomach, And he'll crawl over rocks or crawl over things, and he'll drop this little pharynx down and basically just vacuum up the food. So you will see these in class. Another Platyhelminthes is the tapeworm, and this is parasitic. For the tapeworm here, this entire head right here, so this structure that the line is right here, this entire head is called a scolex, S-C-O-L-E-X. And this head will embed using these hooks right here. There are hooks. They will use these hooks to embed into the intestines. Now, off of this scolex, there are all of these little segments, and they're called proglottids. Proglottids, proglottids. These proglottids actually have both male and female reproductive parts. And most of the time when creatures are hermaphroditic, they do not fertilize themselves. But tapeworms are different. They're parasites. All they want to do is reproduce. And so each one of these proglottids is capable of making 1,000 eggs. They can fertilize themselves, and then segments will break off. So I have a sample tapeworm in a bottle that you'll see in class, and we'll look at those a little bit later. So some of the things about the Platyhelminthes is it's the least complex of the worms. They are acoelomates. Now, a coelom is a body cavity, and the word a means without. So these little guys are flatworms. They don't have a body cavity. They're just flat layers of tissue, and we'll discuss the coelom more in class. So they have thin, solid bodies. It's not like us where they have a huge, big body cavity. So they have one body opening. They have a pretty decent nervous system. They can respond to stimuli. They have muscles. The pharynx is the tube that extends for feeding. The ganglia is like a super primitive brain. Like I said, it's a whole bunch of nerve bundles. The eye spots are sensitive to light. For the tapeworm, the adults can grow up to 10 meters in length, which is huge. We don't see a lot of tapeworm in the U.S., but third world countries or developing countries will see that. It has to do with their contaminated water sources and just overall their sanitation. So the scolex and the proglottids we just talked about. Most are hermaphroditic. Sexual reproduction can also happen with others. We talked about the tapeworm basically can fertilize itself, but most Platyhelminthes will actually sexually reproduce with internal fertilization. Planarians are awesome. They can regenerate. You can cut part of them off and they regenerate. So if you cut their head off, they'll make a new head. If you cut their tail, they'll make a new tail. If you cut them in half, they'll make 2 new halves. It's just they're typically really small and hard to cut. So here is a type of flatworm. Here's an actual planarian. You can see the eye spots. The nerve net runs down through here, and you can actually see right here where the pharynx is. And then there's a sketch of the tapeworm in its entirety. It shows you the hooks and the little suckers onto the side there, the little proglottids. All right, moving to our last group for the animal kingdom in this introduction, we have the nematodes, and they are considered the roundworms. We have the ascaris, the trichinella, hookworms, pinworms, heartworms, which may be familiar to you if you have a pet. And nematodes are considered pseudo-coelomates, and we discussed that pseudo means false. And so while this may have a cavity, it's a pseudo-coelomate because the internal organs aren't actually attached to the cavity. Basically, it's like all of their digestive and reproductive organs are just free floating inside of there. So that's a fake coelom. They can live on land, typically moist land. They can live in freshwater, saltwater. They can live in people. Those are the really interesting ones. So they can be parasitic. Lots of plants have, and fungus have parasites that are nematodes. But one of the biggest evolutionary steps we take here is that a nematode has two body openings. We finally have a mouth and an anus, so this is a big ordeal in the whole evolutionary process. They have a more complex digestive system. They can have a thicker outer coating that keeps a host from destroying it, or so that it can stay outside of the water. Unfortunately, this year we are not dissecting the nematode Ascaris. So some of the diversity, the Ascaris worm mainly affects children that ingest eggs from dirty food and water. They are these really long worms. They kind of look like noodles, and they basically end up inside your intestines. Um, it is a vicious cycle, and a lot of children in developing countries actually will die from complications with the Ascaris worms. Hookworms you get in a lot of times if you walk around barefoot, the hookworm will enter the bottom of your foot. It'll actually crawl up to your leg, and then it will feed off of you. Pinworms are not uncommon, especially if you live in a sandy area or had a sandy, like I had a sand little play area at home. Um, and so you get these little pinworms, and they basically cause severe itching. You can take a pill and get rid of them really easily, though, so don't worry. Trichinella is caused by trichinosis, or or eating undercooked pork. And that is one of the reasons they always tell you to cook pork for 350 and make sure that its internal temperature is high enough, etc. So some of the examples I have here are, this is a quick little picture of the Ascaris worms and how they look inside the intestines. Here's a male Ascaris worm. Here's a female. They actually have internal fertilization. There's nothing inside of them except for a intestinal tract and reproductive organs. So you can pretty much tell what their life's all about. You have some of the worms that can enter into your body right here. Some of the nematodes are responsible for causing some of the things like this elephantitis. I'm trying to look through here really quickly. Some of the worms can actually get embedded into your muscles. So this is trichinella. And so here's the little worms. And those are nematodes. So those are our first 4 phylum. They're all very simplistic. You have the Porifera. You have the Cnidarians, the Platyhelminthes, and the Nematodes. So from all of this information, you should be able to fill out your diagrams and fill out your charts.